So this wants to be a video response to the very interesting and thought-provoking and also very well done in terms of montage Matt Easton's video about morals in historical perspective, and especially the idea that we have of Vikings as raiders and pillagers mostly. And to be honest, it's just a pretext, because I really don't have anything to criticize or really respond to negatively towards Easton's video. I wanted to point out that I'm a great fan of Matt Easton. I watch his videos regularly since many years, so he's a really great guy, and a great YouTuber. He goes straight to the point. He's very informative, and he's the kind of, even though he has a lot of ability of synthesis, which I don't have. But I wanted just to add a pair of thoughts that we have, that I have, excuse me, about the Viking topics that seem to be so much of interest in later times, in later years, maybe because there's been a bit more of attention, especially from popular culture towards Vikings, a renewed interest. I think it's a positive thing overall. And I wanted just to point out that this idea of of criticizing who was the worst, who was worse, better in terms of morals, who did the most cruel things, and who was instead the best guy, has never thrilled me in historical terms. And one of the of the reasons why I actually don't like this kind of approach, which I see so much widespread, when especially people who have just, I don't know, scholastic knowledge of history tend to venture in by talking and criticizing. I think it's annoying, because it doesn't go straight to the point. The thoughts I have are especially regarding not really the Viking perspective that, as Matt Easton recalls, is unfortunately unknown to us, because these guys didn't write anything down, or at least they didn't have historiographical, written historiographical tradition. Well, not really a historiographical tradition in general, but obviously they had a memory of their past. And they handed it down generation to generation, and unfortunately all that knowledge is lost to us. So what we have, and not just for the Vikings, but also, for instance, for the Saxons, compared to the Franks before the Frankish conquest of Saxony, or about the Germans from a Roman perspective, for instance, is just one is just the perspective of the others, of peoples that were external and often enemy to the Vikings in this case. Let's stick to them. And in terms of morals, I agree, there is a lot of difficulty to to see. I mean, nobody should actually have an apologetic intent towards violence. I think especially a good historian should never say, it doesn't matter who killed who, whose responsibility it was in terms of these massacres, especially of civilians and, let's say, innocent people. Yet we have to put things into context, and one interesting thing about Vikings to me is they're present in what is basically today's central and northern France. So we're talking about the West Francia, the time, because that's probably, first of all, the best documented area of action of the Vikings. I mean, it's the place where the Vikings probably did most harm in more places, and the places where, let's say, that produced more sources about them and that talked more about them, and of which consequently in historical perspective we have more knowledge about Viking activities at the time and in those places especially. And what we notice is this, that generally speaking we tend, at least, the less we know history in general, this idea of, the Franks, or the peoples we inhabited that Central European region dominated by the Carolingian dynasty, living more or less peacefully, with I'd say more or less than more, but that at least they had their own business, that they had their own social, development in order. And at a certain time, the Vikings arrived, and they caused a lot of harm. They basically sent their economics into ashes, and they spread fear, terror, and so on. But it's exactly from that perspective that we notice very interesting dynamics here. First of all, the Carolingians, as you know, were able to make last their empire for a very short time, and because they probably have very low concept of the public, of the state, we could say, in modern terms. I mean, they considered the empire basically as a private property that they could use as they liked, and when at every generation they divided by tradition, by Frankish Germanic tradition, the father's goods to their among the various sons. I mean, even the empire itself, even in the Carolingian dynasty itself, this happened, and it brought to the division of the Carolingian Empire into the various kingdoms that eventually had survived the Carolingian dynasty itself. And what we notice, for instance, is that, and I think it's quite relevant, that Viking raids in that area of northern France and Benelux and even parts of Germany were actually caused by the institutional weakness of the Carolingian world in itself. So I'm not saying the Vikings would have not happened to Europe if the Carolingian Empire would have remained stable, but like many other times in history, when a great power collapses, all the relatively weaker entities, in this case piracy and adventurers and substantially bands, because originally these were the Vikings. The most organized expeditions were actually came later, and only after they saw what they could have they had been able to achieve, even with just smaller bands. And what you see in this context, first of all, is that the same Franks sent the Vikings to fight against one another. It seems to me, I don't know, Charles the Bald sent Vikings against Ludwig of Germany. He, you see, the Franks didn't care much about using these guys. That obviously they probably loathed, meaning that Franks surely didn't have much sympathy for what the Vikings were doing. From a communitarian perspective, they saw them as outsiders, they saw them as Ethans and stuff. But it's interesting how these powers, these Carolingian Christian powers, actually used the Vikings like they did with any other people that could be useful for their political and military aims. And another interesting aspect, always in France, is that seemingly, and I don't know how much historiographically this has been exploited as a concept, how much it's been debated. I learned it from certain studies, so surely there is been some debate about it, but I'm not much aware of it. Is that it's very provoking as an idea, is that the Viking invasions in France actually strengthened the Western Frankish monarchy. You say, why? We're basically attacking the Western Frankish kingdom, so how could it strengthen its monarchy? Well, the answer is this, that already at the time the Western Frankish kings had a lot of trouble at controlling France. Basically until the beginning of the 13th century, the French crown had a lot of troubles at controlling everything, basically controlled just a very tiny part of today's France. And it was already the problem at the time, because the political disgregation of the Western Frankish kingdom was quite fast, quite precocious, and I don't have the time to explain why, but the point is this, that all those peripheral Frankish counts that basically rebelled or were simply out of reach to the king's authority, were actually a negative force for the unity of the kingdom, naturally, because they wanted to do things on their own. They wanted to expand their dominions independently from the king. And what happened when the Vikings arrived is that the Vikings, for evident geographical reasons, went hitting all around France, especially on the coasts. Think about Aquitaine, think about Normandy, think about other areas, even going up rivers, arriving even up to the Massif Central of France. And what happened is that the local populations that were under those counts had rebelled to the kings, and that they were vexed by these comital powers, actually took the chance to plead to the Frankish king to tell him, look, these guys, these counts that officially are here in your name aren't doing anything for us. So and obviously this was a chance to take the comital power out of their backs and pleading directly to the king. And therefore many areas of France that had been devastated by the Vikings turned up to the king for help, and were disposed to grant him more power. And it's possible, even though even the same areas where the Western Frankish kings were hit by the Vikings, that what happened in the rest of France might have strengthened up the Western Frankish authority in a way. It basically kept it like a referential point for, at least from a merely political point of view, merely even ideal point of view, the the element of power that could put things back together after these rides hit. And another interesting aspect, again, is that Vikings weren't actually there just to pillage or plunder. Obviously, here I'm talking especially about the 9th century. I'm not really talking about what happened in the following century with the settlement of the Normans into Normandy and stuff. I'm talking about the very first century. Well, not really the very first, because things happened from the 8th, but for France, the worst moment was possibly the 9th century. Well, definitely in the 9th century. What happened is that the Vikings arrived sometimes, at the beginning, just pillaging in short rides, with a very short-viewed objective of, and just maybe even checking what the situation was like, if further achievements could be obtained. And eventually, when they saw that it worked, because the local powers were quite weak, or at least they could react in only very slowly against them, they began to set permanently, maybe to arrive in summer and to spend winter in France. And what happened in these contexts, really, it's not just plunder, it's not just violence, it's not just prisoner taking, but it's also trading with the same people that were actually there, and maybe that had their neighbors pillaged and stuff. And maybe these Vikings even allied with these people, because maybe, I don't know, there was a count of that region that had interests to fight against his neighbor count, and therefore he used this band of Vikings and he said them, let's go pillage that place together. And that's how it happened. And I think that in terms of moral judgment of the Vikings in general, it's quite interesting to see how, in spite of the few sources that we have were generally official sources, so sources were heavily influenced by a political will, a political aim. Actually, the interaction between the Vikings and the peoples of the areas who were pillaged actually was a much more, I can't say friendly, but at least a much more complex relationship than what we're used to think. And this therefore even brings you very far from asking you, what's the moral story of this, because at least we were worse in moral terms and better in moral terms. Because the actual point here is that you see men, maybe, coming from different backgrounds, from different cultures, and from different religions, but actually doing what men do all the time. That is a bit arguing, a bit killing each other, a bit trading, a bit, getting together. And therefore, I wonder what's the point of wondering, who were worse. I mean, it's much more interesting from a historical perspective to go look at what happened and trying to understand, once again, this extremely complex nature of ours. And I believe this is one of the most interesting things you can do in history. So thanks for listening.